Jane Fonda spent more than 6 decades inside Hollywood's most powerful circles. Over time, her public image shifted from rising star to outspoken activist, and with that shift came distance from certain people she once worked alongside. While she rarely used the word hate, her interviews, memoirs, and reflections late in life reveal strong resentment towards specific actors whose behavior, beliefs, or working style conflicted with her values. This video examines 6 actors whose relationships with Jane Fonda were marked by tension, disappointment, or lasting disapproval. Stay until the end, because the final name reveals why Jane Fonda eventually stopped protecting Hollywood's unspoken rules. Clint Eastwood. Jane Fonda's discomfort with Clint Eastwood did not begin with a single argument, a public statement, or a specific film project. It developed gradually, shaped by the era they both rose from and the values each came to represent as their careers matured. To understand why Jane Fonda strongly disliked Clint Eastwood, it is necessary to look beyond personal interaction and examine what Eastwood symbolized within Hollywood and American culture during the height of his influence. Clint Eastwood emerged as a defining figure of a certain type of masculinity in American cinema. His screen presence was built on restraint, authority, and a moral certainty that left little room for doubt or self-reflection. For many audiences, this image was reassuring. For Jane Fonda, especially as she evolved personally and politically, it became troubling. She viewed this portrayal not simply as acting, but as reinforcement of ideas she believed were harmful, outdated, and resistant to accountability. Jane Fonda's transformation during the late 1960s and 1970s placed her at odds with much of Hollywood's traditional power structure. As she became increasingly outspoken about war, gender equality, and political responsibility, she grew more critical of public figures who avoided self-examination or dismissed social change. Clint Eastwood, in her view, stood firmly on the opposite side of that divide. His public comments, political positioning, and film choices reinforced an image of authority without empathy, strength without vulnerability. What bothered Jane Fonda most was not Eastwood's success or talent, but the way his influence shaped cultural attitudes. She believed that his characters often normalized aggression while discouraging questioning or dissent. In interviews years later, Fonda made it clear that she saw this as more than entertainment. She believed film had power, and with that power came responsibility. Eastwood's refusal to engage with that responsibility frustrated her deeply. There was also a personal dimension to her dislike. Jane Fonda felt that Hollywood had long rewarded men who projected control while dismissing women who challenged it. Eastwood's career, to her, was an example of how easily authority was granted to men who never had to justify their position. This stood in sharp contrast to her own experience, where every opinion, every protest, and every career decision was scrutinized and often condemned. Unlike some of her other professional conflicts, Jane Fonda never suggested that her issue with Clint Eastwood was rooted in direct mistreatment or personal betrayal. Instead, her dislike was ideological and cultural. She saw him as a representation of an industry unwilling to evolve, an industry that resisted voices like hers while celebrating figures who upheld traditional power dynamics. As time passed, Jane Fonda became more direct in expressing her views. She did not attempt to soften her criticism or reframe it diplomatically. In her later years, she spoke with clarity about the men in Hollywood she believed had shaped the industry in damaging ways. Clint Eastwood remained one of those names, not because of a single incident, but because of everything he stood for during a critical period of her life and career. Dustin Hoffman. Jane Fonda's dislike of Dustin Hoffman grew out of a different kind of discomfort than the one she felt toward Clint Eastwood. Where Eastwood represented an ideology she rejected, Hoffman represented something more personal and more troubling to her. Behavior that reflected how women were treated behind the scenes in Hollywood for decades, often excused in the name of talent or artistic intensity. Dustin Hoffman built his reputation as a serious actor, someone praised for realism, emotional commitment, and immersion into his roles. For many years, this reputation shielded him from scrutiny. Jane Fonda, however, became increasingly skeptical of the way certain actors were allowed to cross personal boundaries while being defended as difficult geniuses. To her, Hoffman was part of that pattern. Fonda's criticism of Hoffman did not initially surface as public condemnation. Like many actresses of her generation, she learned early that speaking openly about discomfort could damage a career. Instead, resentment accumulated quietly, shaped by stories shared privately among women in the industry and by her own experiences observing how power operated on film sets. What disturbed her most was not a single allegation or headline, but the normalization of behavior that placed male comfort above female dignity. As conversations around accountability began to change years later, Jane Fonda chose not to remain silent. She spoke openly about how behavior long dismissed as harmless or method acting had real consequences. In doing so, she drew a clear line between artistic dedication and personal misconduct. Dustin Hoffman, in her view, had benefited for too long from an industry unwilling to challenge its own stars. Fonda's criticism was measured, not emotional. She did not attack Hoffman's talent or deny his impact on cinema. Instead, she questioned the culture that allowed influential men to behave without consequence while women were expected to tolerate discomfort for the sake of professionalism. Her dislike was rooted in disappointment. Disappointment that someone so respected had failed to recognize the harm caused by unchecked power. It also reflects a broader shift in Jane Fonda's life. By the time she spoke openly about Hoffman, she no longer felt obligated to protect Hollywood's reputation. She believed that silence had contributed to decades of imbalance, and she saw honesty as a responsibility rather than a risk. Hoffman became one of the names she was willing to mention because his story represented a larger truth about how the industry functioned. For Jane Fonda, this was not about settling old scores. It was about acknowledging what had been ignored and refusing to excuse behavior simply because it came from someone celebrated. Her dislike of Dustin Hoffman was shaped by principle, not rivalry, and it marked a clear break from the culture of silence she had once been forced to accept. Sylvester Stallone. Jane Fonda's dislike of Sylvester Stallone was never rooted in personal conflict or direct confrontation. Instead, it developed from a deeper rejection of the Hollywood culture and messaging that Stallone came to represent during the peak of his fame. To Fonda, Stallone symbolized a version of American cinema that celebrated aggression, dominance, and emotional simplicity at a time when she was pushing for nuance, accountability, and reflection. Stallone rose to prominence as the embodiment of the action hero. His characters were designed to endure pain silently, respond to conflict with force, and resolve moral questions through physical victory rather than dialogue. While these films attracted massive audiences, Jane Fonda viewed them as reinforcing ideas that discouraged empathy and critical thinking. She believed that repetition of such narratives shaped public attitudes in ways that were rarely questioned. As Fonda became more politically active, she grew increasingly critical of entertainment that avoided social responsibility. Stallone's work, in her view, existed comfortably within a system that rewarded spectacle over substance. She did not see his films as isolated creative choices, but as part of a broader industry trend that resisted cultural growth. This made him, symbolically, someone she strongly opposed. What frustrated Jane Fonda was not Stallone's personal behavior, but the way his success was celebrated without challenge. She observed how action films dominated screens while stories centered on women vulnerability or dissent struggled for equal attention. Stallone became, to her, a marker of imbalance, proof that Hollywood continued to prioritize familiar power fantasies over more complex human experiences. Fonda also believed that this type of storytelling affected how masculinity was defined. She worried that young audiences were being taught that strength meant suppression of emotion and refusal to question authority. Stallone's characters rarely doubted themselves, and that certainty, while entertaining, troubled her. She felt it left no space for accountability or moral growth. Unlike some of the other men she openly criticized, Jane Fonda rarely addressed Stallone directly. Her dislike was expressed through broader commentary about the industry rather than personal remarks. This distance made her position even clearer. She was not interested in individual disputes. She was challenging a system that rewarded one kind of voice while marginalizing others. Over time, Stallone remained a consistent symbol in Fonda's mind of an industry unwilling to evolve. Her opposition was calm but firm, shaped by years of observing how influence was used and celebrated. In naming him among the actors she disliked, Jane Fonda was not accusing him of wrongdoing. She was rejecting what he represented in the cultural landscape she had spent her life trying to change. Robert Redford. Jane Fonda's relationship with Robert Redford stands apart from the other names in this video because it was built on long-term collaboration rather than ideological distance alone. They worked together multiple times, creating some of the most recognizable films of their era. To the public, their partnership appeared effortless, defined by chemistry and mutual respect. Privately, however, the dynamic was far more complicated, and over time it became a source of frustration for Jane Fonda. From the beginning, Fonda recognized Redford's discipline and professionalism. He approached filmmaking with seriousness and control, qualities that helped establish his reputation as a leading man and later as a director. But those same qualities often translated into rigidity. Fonda felt that Redford preferred structure over dialogue and authority over collaboration, especially when creative decisions were being made. As Jane Fonda grew more confident in her voice, she became less willing to defer quietly. This created tension in a working relationship that had once relied on unspoken roles. Redford was accustomed to being listened to, while Fonda increasingly expected to be heard. Their disagreements were rarely public and almost never dramatic, but they accumulated over time, leaving a sense of imbalance that Fonda found difficult to ignore. Fonda later suggested that Redford struggled to fully accept strong female perspectives within the creative process. While he respected her talent, she believed he did not always respect her authority. This subtle dismissal was more frustrating to her than open conflict would have been. It reflected a broader issue she encountered repeatedly in Hollywood, where women were praised for performance but excluded from power. Despite these tensions, Jane Fonda continued to work with Redford, recognizing the professional value of their partnership. Yet the decision came at a personal cost. Each collaboration reinforced the feeling that her contributions were being filtered through someone else's control. Over time, admiration gave way to weariness, and weariness to quiet resentment. Jane Fonda never attempted to rewrite history or deny the success they shared. She acknowledged the quality of their films and Redford's impact on cinema. Her dislike was not fueled by hostility, but by disappointment. She expected more from someone who had benefited so greatly from working alongside her. By later years, Jane Fonda spoke more openly about these experiences, framing them not as personal grievances, but as examples of systemic imbalance. Robert Redford remained an important figure in her career, but also a reminder of how even respected collaborations could leave lasting dissatisfaction when equality was absent. Bill Cosby. Jane Fonda's dislike of Bill Cosby developed slowly and became more defined as time passed and information surfaced. Unlike some of the other men in this video, Cosby was once widely viewed as a moral figure in American entertainment. He cultivated an image of wisdom, responsibility, and authority, an image that Jane Fonda later came to see as deeply misleading and damaging. During the height of Cosby's influence, he was treated as untouchable. His opinions carried weight far beyond television, and his public persona was often used as a benchmark for respectability. Jane Fonda found this troubling long before the wider public began questioning it. She believed that Hollywood had elevated Cosby not only as a performer, but as a moral voice without properly examining the power that came with that status. Fonda was particularly disturbed by the way Cosby spoke about others, especially women and younger performers. His tone, often framed as guidance or discipline, struck her as controlling rather than constructive. She felt that his authority went largely unchallenged because of his success and carefully managed public image. To her, this reflected a familiar pattern in Hollywood, men being trusted implicitly while dissenting voices were ignored. As allegations against Cosby became public years later, Jane Fonda did not express shock. Instead, she spoke with a sense of grim recognition. What unsettled her most was not just the accusations themselves, but the length of time it took for them to be taken seriously. She viewed this delay as evidence of an industry that protected its most powerful figures at the expense of truth. Fonda's dislike of Cosby was rooted in betrayal, not personal but cultural. She believed that audiences had been encouraged to trust him, to see him as a symbol of integrity, while troubling behavior remained hidden. This contradiction reinforced her long-standing criticism of Hollywood's tendency to prioritize reputation over accountability. Unlike other figures she challenged for ideological reasons, Cosby represented something more corrosive to Jane Fonda. He embodied how moral authority could be manufactured and weaponized. His fall from grace did not bring her satisfaction, only confirmation of concerns she felt had been ignored for too long. In naming Bill Cosby among the actors she disliked, Jane Fonda was not revisiting old conflicts. She was acknowledging the danger of unchecked influence and the consequences of silence. For her, Cosby's story was a reminder that Hollywood's most comforting images could conceal realities the industry was unwilling to confront. John Wayne. Jane Fonda's dislike of John Wayne was the most direct and the least ambiguous of all the names in this video. Unlike other actors whose conflicts with her developed quietly or symbolically, Wayne represented an open and lasting opposition to everything Jane Fonda came to believe in politically, culturally, and morally. Their divide was never hidden, and it never softened with time. John Wayne was more than a film star. He was treated as a national symbol embodying patriotism, wartime heroism, and traditional American authority. For Jane Fonda, this image was deeply misleading. She believed Wayne's public persona simplified complex realities and promoted ideas that discouraged questioning and dissent. As she became more vocal about war, government accountability, and social justice, Wayne became a figure she openly challenged. Fonda viewed Wayne's influence as particularly dangerous because it was rarely examined critically. His films were celebrated as representations of strength and honor, yet she felt they avoided responsibility for the real-world consequences of the values they promoted. To her, Wayne's work glorified conflict while ignoring its human cost. This was not an artistic disagreement, it was a moral one. Their opposition became public during the Vietnam War era, when Jane Fonda's activism placed her in direct contrast to Wayne's outspoken support for military action. Wayne criticized her openly, questioning her loyalty and character. Fonda, in turn, refused to retreat or apologize for her beliefs. Rather than escalate the conflict emotionally, she maintained a firm, unwavering stance that reflected her conviction rather than hostility. What solidified her dislike was not Wayne's criticism, but the way Hollywood and the public responded to it. Wayne's attacks were often defended or dismissed as patriotic expression, while Fonda was condemned as divisive. This imbalance confirmed her belief that certain voices were protected simply because they aligned with dominant narratives. In later years, Jane Fonda reflected on John Wayne not with anger, but with clarity. She did not attempt reconciliation or reinterpretation. She saw him as a symbol of an era she had spent her life trying to confront and move beyond. Her refusal to soften her view was deliberate. To her, acknowledging disagreement without compromise was an act of honesty. By naming John Wayne among the actors she disliked, Jane Fonda closed a long chapter of silence. This was not about personal resentment. It was about refusing to rewrite history in a way that made discomfort disappear. Before you leave, if you appreciate videos that go deeper than headlines and explore the real stories behind Hollywood legends, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.